Awesome. I am like so totally excited to have John Jennings here with me. And John Jennings is a friend, but also like superstar professor, media and cultural studies, also cooperating faculty of the Department of Creative Writing there at UC Riverside. Nasser Jones, hip hop fellow at Harvard, is one of his many achievements in the past. 2 times Eisner Award winner. Gosh, wow. And finally, like the critical maker, like the man, the person, the human being out there doing this work of this on the scholarly front, on the creative front, and in this really powerful, impactful way. Welcome, John. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Wow. It's always odd to hear people like introduce you or like say things about you. Like, I'm just
Yeah, I know. I've been there. Yeah, it is weird to be kind of objectively kind of talked about. Let me hold on 2 seconds. I, for some reason, got us on the wrong slide here. So I'm just gonna, so John, look, what, like, I haven't even asked you this question and we've been friends for a long time. Why comics? Why comic studies?
Well, why comics is like, because they're awesome, of course, right? Because they're such a wonderful storytelling medium, and, I wouldn't be here without them, as far as like making, studying things and making work. I just think that they're a really powerful medium, and in our country still not as respected as I think they need to be, but as far as like how I got into comic studies, that was odd. So basically, when I was in graduate school at the University of Illinois back in the early 90s, this is around the same time that the Scott McCloud book came out, Understanding Comics. And so when I was working on my MFA in design, I really wanted to do something around like, essentially it was like kind of like a semiotics assignment, a semiotics project around culture and symbolism, around different types of signage. And so my professor was like, well, that seems like a sociology project, what about your love of comics? What about something around comics? And I was like, I think I was unaware of Scott McCloud's book at the time, but they knew about it, and I was always trying to do projects in their classes and write about comics all the time, and I think that's kind of like how that started. And so I ended up working on a comics project around this graphic design and comics communication for my final like MFA project, and among other things. And I think that's kind of like where the bug started, and then what happened was like, ended up teaching after that at Jackson State University in graphic design, and which is, to me, comics are pure graphic design, but there's a rhetorical side to graphic design that I think people don't really think about, as far as like the process and about like just the rhetorical ideas around getting people to notice things, or as I said, the linguistic notions of like semiotics and things, all these different like humanities get added to graphic design in the practice, because I think it's a way to not necessarily legitimize graphic design, but also it adds other feelers to it as a way of seeing. And so, so I worked at Jackson State for a while, then I came back to University of Illinois, and of course, tenure track, you need to have a research focus, right? And I became really interested in like web comics and like different types of comics distribution systems outside of the direct market and outside of like paper comics, right? And this was around the same time that printing on demand was taking off, right? So like companies like Lulu and things of that nature were actually starting to get ground. And so there wasn't really any excuses anymore for me to not make comics. And so that's kind of like where I started, with just looking at who was making comics, how they were being distributed, what formats, that kind of thing, which kind of led me from a formal aspect into like more wider ideas around comic studies. And so then, of course, I met Damian Duffy super early, because we've been working together like, which was around the same time I met you, now I think about it, was like about 15 years ago, something like that or more.
Mm-hmm.
And we really fell in love with the idea of diversity in comics, like across the board, not only like who was making them, but how they were being distributed, yada, yada, yada. And so we ended up doing a lot of curatorial work. So a lot of my work in comic studies really starts out looking at the form and the persistence of the form and different ways of deploying comics, you know, and that's kind of like where I started. And yeah, that was kind of like long-winded, but it's been a while. So so that's how I ended up here.
Yeah, no, I love it. I mean, a big part love and passion, another big part kind of necessity,
Yeah,
bread and butter on the table, and
a lot of
then fine.
curiosity.
Right? Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, absolutely. And then that community part, right? Which
that's
is
right.
like, I mean, can you think of any other, I mean, I'm being biased here, but like, where else on a campus do we automatically reach out and do projects with people from different parts of the campus? I mean, they say we do this, but we actually don't
You
much. But
really don't. Like, yeah, exactly. Yeah,
yeah,
it's funny to me because like I love the way that like, you know, a lot of modern campuses think of like interdisciplinarity as this new thing, which is funny to me. I was like, well, that's how human beings learn stuff. You know, you
yeah,
don't actually it's funny because like when you're studying a particular aspect of culture or whatever, it really isn't how people learn. You know, people learn things by discovering them and actually interacting with each other, you know. And so to me, comics actually like helps break down those barriers, you know, like you said, kick down those silos and actually you can be a comic book artist and work with a physicist or like a historian or what have you to get
hmm,
their ideas across because it is a medium, but it also is like this really collaborative um, endeavor, you know. So
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, speaking of which, prison industrial complex for beginners, right? I mean,
Oh
what a
yeah.
great example of that. Blacker the ink. Well, the whole, of course, with Damien. So
Damien.
all of these are collaborative. So tell us a little bit about, you know, your work with Francis and then, you know, with James and then Damien.
Oh yeah. So basically, yeah, me and Damien started out working together because of we had a lot in common. Like he had kind of fallen back into publishing independently. I was kind of dabbling in it, and we met because Scott McCloud came to campus. I brought him to campus, and he kind of like crashed the party, so to speak. He kind of crashed the the dinner because he was a friend of Dan Yesbick, who we know, and also and
Mm-hmm.
Dan Yesbick was a friend of R.C. Harvey's, who lived in the town of Champaign, and was really good friends with Scott McCloud. So they all like triple crashed the the dinner with him. And then we just started. He started seeing me at a couple of events, and he came by my class. I was teaching a web comics class, and yeah, and we just went out to lunch, and we just started talking comics and started working on stuff together, and realized that we had a lot of like interest politically, and also as far as like what we thought good comics were and how they could teach people. And so the whole actually was a remix of a story that I did, you know, the same name. It was called Whole Parts of a Whole, you know, and it was one of my first like Lulu comics I did, and we saw a lot of good things in it. And I think at the time I was really into like I just want to be a comic book artist. So I thought it'd be kind of cool to create a white character, you know, being a black artist. And I realized very soon, like, you know, that I made a mistake, that actually it would be better for me to create a black character because of the dearth of representation, you know. And so that was the wormhole that we kind of went through, you know. But it's been a very fruitful and wonderful collaboration with Damien because he's super smart. You know, he has a PhD in library information science. And together, and I think you might have called this as no, maybe it was Jared. One of y'all, it was neither you or Jared calls the four-arm creator, you know, because basically we're like one mind with like four arms, you know,
Mm-hmm.
doing all of the work, you know. And you know, we have the ability to take an idea from like the beginning stages all the way up to completion, you know, because of our different skill sets, which is
Mm-hmm.
pretty cool. As far as like the prison industrial complex book, that was a James Braxton Peterson, and excuse me for a second. Sorry, somebody was calling. My bad. I'm like, yeah, so that was with James Braxton Peterson, and basically it was you know, he approached me about doing it, pitched it to Stacey Robinson, who was part of the Black Kirby collective that we started. And yeah, and it kind of went from there. I mean, James and I have been friends for a long time and wanted to work on something. And he got a chance to do it, and we thought it'd be a good idea to do it because it was a project that we were extremely interested in. And yeah, and that's kind of like how that book jumped off. But this is right after we finished up, or was it before? I want to say it was before we were working on Kindred, what Damien and I did the Kindred adaptation. So, but then Stacy and I he worked on that book with us as a colorist. We worked on this project, and then we ended up doing Am Alfonso Jones. So it was like all this Black trauma. It's like Black trauma galore that we're working on with these books, but very, very topical, very great books. The Black of the Ink actually was a project that started when I was still at University of Illinois. Francis Gateway used to teach at University of Illinois back in the day. And actually at the beginning of this, Damien was a third editor actually. And the project was called Sweet Christmas. But the editors didn't think that it was they didn't think it was like it was too niche, which we didn't agree. But so the Black of the Ink kind of came from the phrase, the black of the berry, the sweeter the juice. And so it's like the Black of the Ink, and then the name of the intro is the sweeter the Christmas. So it was just kind of a play on words, but also thinking about like how, when you have a comic book page, it starts with the activation of the ink on the page, and it was just talking about the formal aspects of blackness and the fluidity of ink, that kind of thing. But yeah, and Frances was wonderful. So she actually had already edited a book before. We had a contact at Wayne State at first, and then Frances ended up moving to another job. I ended up moving to another job. Frances ended up moving to another job again. Yeah, it was. And she ended up adopting a little girl, and it was pretty wild. It took us a while to get it lined up, and then Damien actually started working on his PhD, so he couldn't do the project anymore. And but it took us a while, and ended up at Rutgers. But it was a really great experience. I think we have some of the top comic scholars, in particular comic scholars of color, and also particularly women of color who are scholars of comics, like Kiana Whitted and Rebecca Wanzo, are in this book, and with some phenomenal essays actually too. So it was really, really cool to work on this.
Yeah,
let's try to do a follow up.
So needed, and so sort of wonderfully recognized by the Eisner Committee.
We were very excited about that too.
That's and then you got to go up a second time. So here we are. We've got Kindred, Parable, and Black Comix Returns.
Yes.
Afrofuturism and comics, for some of our listeners, our viewers. What exactly is that?
Okay, so Afrofuturism is kind of a catch-all term for this generation's of of Black speculative culture. What I mean by speculative, we're talking about types of work that don't seem like they fit into quote unquote reality. So like magic, science fiction, horror, fantasy, these types of spaces get kind of couched under like Black speculative culture. Now, the original term is coined by Mark Derry in 1993 in this essay called Black to the Future. And the book is called Flame Wars. And it was a collection of essays dealing with like technoculture of the early 1990s, the burgeoning of the World Wide Web and, cyber culture and stuff like that. And so what Derry was kind of positing was like, he was looking at how technology was kind of being reshaped by the internet. And he was thinking about like Black people and how Black folk, how we were interacting with cyber culture as well. And he was also thinking about like science fiction and science fiction in particular, like, there really aren't that many Black science fiction writers, that kind of thing, and so it led him to like think about like the Black experience being kind of a dystopian kind of affect, and that basically like, the Middle Passage being like kind of an apocalyptic event, that kind of thing. So these are some of the thought processes that started happening around like the metaphor of the alien and the diaspora as this kind of like cosmic kind of awakening, that kind of thing. And and so basically the Afrofuturism as an aesthetic from that particular standpoint deals with like cyberculture, cybernetic aesthetics or like representations. So it's like cyborgs, robots, spaceships, that kind of thing, but in service of a Afrocentric politic around like, empowering and rewriting how Black folk have like, moved through the world, both narratively and actually. So those are some of the notions that Afrofuturism deal with. And to borrow from Lisa Yazik, she talks about it being like it's almost like a rewriting of the history of the future. Because if you think about it, people of color aren't really shown, as you know, like in a lot of like those older sci-fi stories, right? So what happens to us, And so Afrofuturism utilizes those same technologies to kind of re-articulate those notions, right? In various types of forms, not only like comics, but also, music and poetry and dance and these different aesthetic, kind of critical making spaces, right? So the thing about comics, what's really interesting is that and this trips me out every time I think about it. Around the same time this is being posited, Milestone Media is happening, right? Which is like the at the time it was like the largest, like, most successful Black comic book publisher, and they were like an independent publisher under DC Comics, started by Michael Davis, Dwayne McDuffie, Derek Dingle, and Dennis Cowan, and all African American creators and businessmen who had a deal with DC Comics, and so they were doing these comics that were actually like utilizing some of the aesthetics that Derek was talking about, right? And so he actually had comic books in the essay as illustrations. If you go back and look at the original essay, there's a picture of like hardware from Milestone. There's like Icon and Rocket, There's also an image from Kyle Baker's book, Why I Hate Saturn, In fact, I think the only image in that essay that isn't a comic is by Ramel Z, the Latinx creator, hip hop creator. Is a sculptor and a DJ, right? So anyway, so I guess for me, it's like it always seemed like comics were being estranged from Afrofuturism in some way, even though they were in the conversation at the beginning. So I spent like a lot of time trying to reconnect the beginnings of speculative comics by Black people back to Afrofuturism, because for some reason it was a blind spot, when people were talking about the movement or talking about the aesthetic or whatever you want to call Afrofuturism at the time. So that's kind of like how we got here, because now I teach several classes on Afrofuturism. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, what you guys are doing there at UCR is amazing, and putting the sort of conceptual vocabulary, the conceptual kind of nuggets of knowledge for future generations to be able to run with them and revise it and go somewhere new. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It's been really great. I mean, we have a minor in science fiction in media and cultural studies. Yeah. And we have kind of an intro to Afrofuturism. There's one on horror and Afrofuturism, and there's also one on now there's a new one on Black superheroes and politics. So pretty exciting.
Yeah. You guys are, path blazing, you and Nilo and others working over there. I know this is a kind of, you're clearing it, speaking of conceptual kind of clearing of spaces, you're doing something new, or maybe not so new, but bringing in horror and horror theory into kind of race politics.
Right. So I guess, when we go back to some of our earlier conversations that me and Adelifu Nama were having at Loyola Marymount back in the day, we actually had a couple of think tanks called Astro Blackness, where a bunch of us who were like working on speculation and Blackness were just having like these conversations at LMU about the limitations of Afrofuturism, the different iterations of it, and because the thing is like, well, you can easily say like, well, this is speculative and Black, so I'm gonna make it Afrofuturist, right? It can be an umbrella, right? But if you're coming from a space where you're used to thinking about genre and you're used to thinking about tropes that actually inform genres, then you look at something like Kindred and you see it as being gothic, or you see it as being horrific, right? And those tropes actually like are things that we pick up in the academy and also in this fan culture, right? So, you can't, it's kind of like taking something like The Exorcist and saying, oh, this is Afrofuturist, or this is just futurist, you know what I'm saying? So we were thinking like, well, how does Black horror actually fit into this? Is it Afrofuturist or is it something else? And depending upon how you look at it, some people would say, yeah, some people would say, okay, well, Black speculative culture encompasses all of that, definitely. And this is Afrofuturist because of these notions or whatever. But I'm of the opinion that, you know, there's a particular affect that is connected to horror that is very specific, you know. And so I came up with this term with Stanford Carpenter, with our colleague Stanford, called the ethnogothic, that was actually looking at like the deployment of like Gothic tropes, you know, in a more literary sense, connections with like Blackness in a certain sense, and how they were being used, or they could be used to kind of talk about race in a particular way, and also to let go of those types of traumatic spaces and move forward. Now, more recently, I've been thinking about, I came across this book called Racecraft, that is, so I got these two siblings, these two sisters, I'm forgetting their names right now. But I think the book came out in like 2014 or so. And what it kind of posits is like racism as a spell, or the idea of like witchcraft and racecraft, you know, that kind of thing. And so I came with this notion of like, well, if you look at like H.P. Lovecraft's work, you know, which has been very popular of late, he was extremely xenophobic. He was extremely racist at the beginning of his life. It became his career. And but he gave us like a lot of metaphors to talk about the other, right? And how to use the technologies of monstrosity to talk about certain social ills, that kind of thing. And so I was like, well, it's not Lovecraftian horror, it's racecraftian horror, you know? So basically this newer thing I'm kind of wrestling with as a form is like combining some of the more useful ideas around how Lovecraft was deploying the monster and fusing it with this idea of a mystical notion of how racism functions, you know? Because it does feel like, it feels odd, like, you know, the things that it makes people do is it's so indescribable. You can have someone who's just one of the sweetest, you know, loving people and be like just overtly, violently racist at the same time, you know, and overtly so. So it's like, it's almost like a switch or something, you know? And I think a lot of times the speculative gives us a lot of space to talk about those types of unwieldy, really difficult to understand moments around how we other each other, you know? So that was a lot, but yeah, that's how I think about it. So.
Yeah. No, yeah. And of course, Lovecraft Country just being kind of released absolutely kind of, you know, dovetails with
it's
what you're
right
doing.
In the vein. It's right in the vein with it, you know? And also, and there's a bunch of other projects, even like Bitterroot by David Walker and Chuck Brown and Sanford Green, I think. And of course, our book, Box of Bones, which you have a picture of up here, they're obviously borrowing from those types of ideas, you know? So.
Yeah, and then there's like really like terrible stuff, and and maybe you see some value here, but when Octavia Spencer played the role, you know, Ma, and the horror genre there, I was like, oh man, this, you know, at first I thought it was, you know, started out really interesting, and then it just like slipped right into the worst.
Yeah, it was. Actually, it's funny because I got an opportunity to do a workshop with Jason Blum, and that was one of the questions I asked. They didn't deal with it, but I definitely asked about Mom because there was a lot of potential, you know. But I think what happened, they didn't really deal with the cultural aspects of this Black woman and her particular type of estrangement from being like racialized in particular ways. So it was very like surface, you know, and after seeing something like Get Out and knowing what you can do with the genre, it was a letdown. So
yeah. Definitely.
But she came across as like angry Manny.
Exactly, right. Yeah,
you
know? No. It started out, it was going to be, I thought it was going to do some really good work. And then it just like business as usual. In fact, worse than business as usual.
That's what I'm saying. So it was kind of, there are other films that they've put out, and I think it depends on the showrunner. Like I really like Sweetheart, for instance. I thought did a better job of dealing with like patriarchy and class as monstrous, you know. So it was a better
definitely.
Yeah.
Teaching, John, we talked a little bit about the incredible things that you all are doing at UCR. What's a John Jennings trademark kind of moment in the classroom?
Well, so when you introduced me, you talked about the idea of critical making, which kind of comes out of like the industrial design parlance. I mean, I'm a designer by training, and I'm also a writer, like both like theoretically, but also creatively. So I think the best way to learn a medium is to do it, right? So a lot of students who are in my intro classes, they've never read comics or they haven't interfaced with them as a medium. So one of the things I love to do is have them write a comic. You know, they don't have to draw it. If they can draw it, that's cool. But you know, we go through a lot of different types of comics. We avoid a lot of superhero stuff because they have like these I think they have like a notion of like what comics can do because of the ubiquitous nature of like superhero narratives, you know, in our culture, you know. So I'll show them a lot of like autobiographical comics, you know, things that are like super surreal, you know, comics like Joe Sacco's work that's reportage, you know, things that are centered in culturally situated comics like Rendezvous in Phoenix, or like Palomar, or like, or even things that are like, you know, about people coming from different classes, like you know, like a fun home, you know, that kind of thing. So they get a expansive like diet of what the medium can do, and then I try to show them a lot of things that are formally very different, like what's her name's work? Oh my goodness. Through the Woods, Emily Carroll's work, you know, which is very formally very inventive and kind of could be both, or even stuff like A Contract with God. So I showed them like a lot of different like, you know, works in that medium. But then I was like, all right, so now pick a topic and write me a 5-page comic, you know. And so what I'll do is I'll actually show them like my process for writing. Actually, I actually have the first comic that I wrote for someone else to you know, to draw. It was like a story idea came with like Charlie Gubau, and you know, we worked on it together as an idea, and I wrote it, and then he drew it, you know. And so it's a really cool exercise to show. Or something like I did this short comic for Reconstruction, and which was like a piece put together by a friend, Edgardo, and I actually got a chance to write a 3-page comic for another artist to draw, you know. And so I can show my process. So I do like a lot of process oriented teaching. And then I was like, okay, so now, you know, you understand what the medium can do. You've seen process. So like, let's see if you could actually write a comic script, you know. And for a lot of people, it's very exciting because they've never actually thought in that manner. So I think that's what I like to do as far as like the theoretical approaches to like reading comics is like, let's make it. In fact, I was just talking to my friend, Tim Fielder, our friend Tim Fielder the other day. And I was like, yeah, I think all editors of comics should make comics. Even if they're bad comics, they should go through the process of making a comic, because I think it would actually change the way they edit, you know. So.
Yeah, and also critics, right? I think that
Yep.
if they actually sat down and did some of that work, they might actually bring not only a new vocabulary, but maybe a new appreciation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're right. So John,
Mm-hmm.
you're in the classroom, you're out of the classroom creating, publishing, but you're also doing these other really important things with expos, with your book series, with Abrams, right? Megascope, the New Sons. You're doing all the covers for those.
Yeah, me and Casey, yeah, Black Kirby, yeah.
Yeah. So tell me why is this important? You know, because I mean, you and I could just teach, right, and get our paycheck.
I don't have to do anything else. It's like I always say that. It's like, yeah, if I really, yeah, we, you know, don't have to do anything else. I mean, I think what it is that, you know, there is a service component to being a professor at a research one, right? So that's one thing. That, you know, doing a project like, you know, working for OSU and doing the cover designs, for instance, is a service-oriented piece where you basically want the books to look as great as possible, to actually try to have like a cohesive, you know, feel to them, which helps provide a space where they can actually do better and sell more books, you know, because people are attracted to the covers and things. And it's also it's this idea of legacy and contribution, you know, that I'm really excited about. And you know, design is how we speak. I mean, it's a research oriented critical making process. Like I see, you got the SoCon logo, for instance, right? That idea of creating a mark that that responds to a client's need is something that actually is like really exciting. But it also is a type of research. It's a type of like critical making that is really like more ubiquitous than a lot of others, right? But as far as like the festival goes, it's, to me, those are also design projects. And I started thinking about this after seeing this interview between Theaster Gates and Bell Hooks at the New School. They were talking about this, and Theaster Gates, who for people that don't know, is like, he's trained as a potter. I think he's trained as like a ceramicist, right? But what he was doing is he got his MFA in this particular practice, and MFA is the terminal degree in art, and you basically get it from doing a lot of that one thing. It's a lot of studio time, right? But you also have a system of processes that are connected to that as well, right? That is taught in a studio class that you can apply to other types of media, right? And that's what he's talking about. It's like, well, he'll go and he's from Chicago. He's in Chicago. He'll go and like use his money to buy a derelict building and like, on the South Side, something like that. And then he'll refurbish it with his money and he'll turn it into like a community center, right? And so the way he looked at it is he's still actually making a vessel. He's still throwing a pot, but it's a communal pot, what I'm saying? So it's a space where people can meet together. And I was like, wow, that's a really great idea. Then I realized that by doing these festivals that we do, that we're actually still creating a design experience, right? So I'm still designing. I'm just thinking about space and how people interact with the experience. And the other thing is the byproduct is, and you know this very well, it means so much for Black and Brown kids to see themselves reflected in the media that they consume, And so if we provide content like that, then we are also informing a different type of more radicalized, more beautiful, more joyful subjectivity, And that's the thing, because a lot of times we're objectified, but we're not the center of the story. To be subject is very powerful. And I think that a lot of people who are in power or privilege don't understand that, because they're so used to being in the center of the narrative, But you can go to one of these festivals as a kid of color, and these kids will never know what it's like to not be the center of a story. This is becoming their norm, and that's why I do it, Now, as far as the Megascope series, it's also the extension of that. So you have so many characters, you have so many people, and you have so many stories that don't get told because the gatekeepers at these mainstream spaces, right? So I was like, well, let's try to create a space where, again, speculation is centered, but also people of color or BIPOC these days, they call it BIPOC people are centered, right? Where the alternative is the norm, so to speak, and speculation is the norm. The idea of like asking, well, why is that like that, And I think what it is, it also fosters questioning societal oppression. It also recenters particular narratives, and it also privileges, people who aren't used to being in the center of those stories. So all of that is connected to me,
Yeah, so important. We need more of those spaces that are focused on our new gens, and we need these spaces where people who have never been on a university campus see themselves on that campus and see themselves in and through things they may already love or things that they've just discovered that they love, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
All that's wonderful.
So, John, as we kind of wind this down, where are you seeing the vitality in comics and in comic studies today?
I think honestly the intersections and the fringes, as usual. I mean, when we did Black of the Ink, it means Francis and I purposely tried to avoid looking at superheroes. There's not one. There's a couple, but it's like, we tried to avoid Black Panther and Luke Cage and things like that as much as we could. Or if we were going to look at it, we're looking at more theoretical framings around that stuff. So I think that, well, first of all, mainstream comics is an oxymoron. Let's be real about it. It's like outside of Superman and Spider-Man, people start to get real foggy on these other characters that we obsess about, To them, like, they've never heard of Black Lightning, that kind of thing. We forget that if we're inside of a culture that does a lot of navel gazing, and I think what starts to happen is like we get really too centralized about that. So I think like the vitality is going to happen at the fuzzy edges, the things that overlap into other spaces, Things are looking at format differently. Things that are looking like fan culture. You know, an early pioneer, of course, was it Jeffrey Brown's book, Milestone Media and Their Fans, I think is the name of it, from University of Mississippi Press. To me, that type of stuff, even though it's like it's backwards looking because it's Milestone, but I think those types of studies are really like, well, who's reading these comics now? Like, who's actually like making these comics now? You know, and that's all on the fringes because we have so many different ways of putting out books now. You know, back in the day, you had to move to New York to become a comic book artist, you know, in the mainstream comics industry, right? Now it's like you can just do that while you're, you know, surfing TikTok and watching CNN. You know, you can make a comic right now. You know, so yeah. So I think that's what it is. It's always at the intersections, I think.
John Jennings, Afrofuturism, horror, race theory, BCAF, comics expos, erasing lines between the ivory tower and the community, in and through comics of color. I love everything you've been doing, what you do, what you're gonna be doing. Thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you, brother. I mean, you and I are the same, man. We do the same kind of work, so I appreciate you having me. You know, it's that's why I think we get it. You know, it's the same kind of work. It's a lot of work.
You know it. It's a lot of work, but
it's wonderful.
All right.